Hey my friends, this is Wayne Yap, a professional poker player, and this time I didn't want to talk to you about my results because I wanted you to actually evaluate me and my poker based on the quality of my thoughts. And today I would like to share with you my level 1 to level 5 thinking when it comes to poker. So what level 1 is when you are thinking about just your hand. So this is when you are at the beginner phase of poker. You know, when you first start out playing poker, you tend to think about, hey, you look at your hand, your 2 whole cards, and you just think about what to do with your hand. Then maybe you start looking at the board and you see, oh, I have 1 pair, I have 2 pair, and everything is in very absolute terms. This is definitely a newbie strategy, and if you have played any decent number of hours in poker, you will actually progress from this really quickly. So I'm sure many of you are no longer thinking about your hand, but if you are, you should try to move on to the next step, which is to actually start considering your opponent's hand. So thinking about what hands your opponent has is basically, now I'm looking at my hand, I'm looking at the board, and I'm thinking, hey, what can my opponent's hand be? Especially if he played a certain way. I mean, there are sometimes even at the highest games, we actually think about what specific hands our opponent can have. And sometimes it's only 1 hand, but that's usually not the case. And therefore, we also need to do some level 3 thinking when we are thinking about our opponent's range. Thinking about opponent's range and how that usually works is when we think about, so we start pre-flop. He took a certain action pre-flop. What does that mean? So let's say he only caught from the big blind versus my buttons open. So that usually means that he doesn't have very strong hands like pocket aces and pocket kings or pocket queens, ace king. And he also doesn't have really bad hands like deuce 7 offsuit, especially if there are no antes. He is really just going to play the middle part of the range. At least that's the strategy most people employ. So when we have a clear understanding of how he constructs his pre-flop range, then we look at the flop and on the board. So the board comes, let's say the board comes ace king 5, no flush draws. He checks, we bet, and he calls. Now we start eliminating some hands from his range. It's not very likely that he has 2 middle cards that has no connection to the board. His range would be a lot of ace x, so he could have an ace pair, or he could have a king pair with 1 king in his hand or 1 ace in his hand, or he could maybe have a straight draw like queen jack, queen 10, jack 10. We start thinking about his range, and maybe he has some small suited cards that are deuce 3, deuce 4, 3 4, because they are also gut shot straight draws. He could also have a 5 pair by having 1 5 in his hand. It's not that likely that he has aces and ace king or kings, so he doesn't have a lot of strong hands. Sometimes he might have king 5, ace 5, or pocket 5s. So those are the strong hands. And then we just think about the turn now. The turn comes a brick. And a brick in poker is when the card totally is disconnected with the flop. Or if we are talking about the turn, we say that the turn is a brick when the turn card comes and it's totally disconnected from the flop. So 8 or 9 is a brick. And then we start thinking, hey, he checks, we bet again, and now he calls again. What hands does he have left? It's not very likely that he has many gut shots because he wouldn't call twice with those gut shot straight draws. Where a gut shot is when he's only waiting for 1 specific card, means he has 4 outs. Then, assuming that the turn did not bring a flush draw, he may be the only gut shot that he would have here, or the only draw that he would have here might be queen jack if he decides to play really sticky and call twice with that hand, because that hand has showdown value with his queen high. So he's basically leading if I'm completely bluffing. Now, what other hands could he have? He could have an ace, he could have a king. He's not very likely to have a 5 or 2 pair or better because he would usually raise them. So we start eliminating his hands, and now we think about his range specifically. Then let's say the river comes, so we have ace king 5 and an 8, the river comes a 9, for example. Now he checks, and we are thinking about our hand and how do we play against him. We start thinking, hey, maybe he folds a king, but he always calls an ace. So we look at our hand and we think about how we want to play against his range. So that's basically how the whole level 3 thinking is. We start thinking about opponent's range. But the next level to that is thinking about our range as well in this spot, and this is range versus range, which is level 4 thinking. So in the example I just gave you of the hand, maybe I should have wrote the hand down so that you would be able to picture it more clearly. But the flop came ace, king, 5, and then turn comes an 8, and then river comes a 9. And in this example, if we think about our range versus his range, we realize that our range is much stronger than his range because we could have pocket aces, we could have ace king, we could have kings, we could have pocket 5s, we have all sorts of combinations of 2 pairs, we have even 6-7s, which would be the nuts. Because if we play 6-7 offsuit pre-flop, we have a lot of combinations of them, and we might choose to c-bet an ace king 5 board, where c-bet is just basically continuing with your aggression from pre-flop and you are continuing the bet. It's called a continuation bet where you bet on the flop. And then when the turn comes at 8, if we had 6-7, whether it's suited or offsuit, we have an open-ended straight draw, and we usually fire this card again. And then now the river comes at 9, and then we realize that, hey, we have 6-7 here a lot of the time, and we have a lot of nutted hands, and he doesn't have very many good hands. So when this river comes, we actually, if we think about our range is very, very strong, and we can be very polarized here. We can bet our very, very strong hands, and we can throw in a lot of bluffs. Then we start thinking about, hey, what bet sizings do we use in this spot? Because we have a really, really polarized range, and he's usually capped, which means he can't have really strong hands. What we can do here is we can actually just go all in, even if it's for 3x of the pot, if we choose to have a lot of bluffs in our range. But the polarization topic is kind of hard to understand. It's kind of hard to explain, and this video I'll just focus on talking about how we are thinking about the 5 levels of poker. So this is level 4 thinking, where you are starting to think about how your range interacts with his range. And then the level 5 when it comes to poker is thinking about your strategy versus your opponent's strategy. So how this works is that instead of thinking about how my range is playing against his range and just thinking about basically how the ranges interact with each other, we need to start thinking and zooming out a little bit, start considering how strategies interact with each other. And what I mean by strategies is that, for example, when we start pre-flop, instead of thinking about just specifically the ranges, we think about, hey, if we play a very, very aggressive 3-betting strategy from the big blind, how does that strategy interact with my opponent's strategy? How does he construct his range? And if he is somebody that raises a lot and then folds a lot to a 3-bet, we realize that, hey, his strategy is a bit flawed here in the sense that he raises too much pre-flop and then he folds too much to 3-bet. So we realize that, hey, our strategy, the best strategy we have, it doesn't matter what hands we have, it's just to play a really, really aggressive strategy against him. And the aggressive strategy would involve us playing a pretty wide 3-betting range. But this whole concept can be applied post-flop as well. And if you dive deeper into the game theory world, you will realize that game theory is all about how one strategy interacts with another strategy. If you haven't learned about game theory, I definitely recommend starting with the Prisoner's Dilemma. It's a pretty clear explanation of how one strategy interacts with the other strategy. Yep. So that's my 5 levels of thinking about poker. I hope you enjoyed this one. I'll see you next time.